Imagine a vibrant city where art and science coexisted, and the memory of the revolution was still felt in the cobblestones. This was Leningrad in 1941, a jewel of the Soviet Union, a symbol of Russian pride and one of the most important cultural centers in Europe. With just over 3 million inhabitants, Leningrad was a vibrant metropolis. Trams ran along the wide avenues, children ran through the parks, and people went to and from work, little imagining that within a few months they would be struggling to simply keep breathing. It was here that the revolution of 1917 was born. Every street was steeped in history. The Winter Palace, which today houses the Hermitage Museum, had been the scene of the fall of Tsarism. Poets, writers, and musicians walked its sidewalks. It was a city where culture flourished even under the control of a rigid regime. In the summer of 1941, the people of Leningrad were going about their daily lives. World War II was already raging in Europe, but for many, the danger seemed far away. Stalin had signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler in 1939, so officially the Soviets and the Nazis were at peace. But this peace was made of thin glass. Leningrad was also a strategic city. In addition to its symbolic value, it housed military factories, shipyards, research centers, and produced essential equipment for the Red Army. It was the second largest city in the USSR, second only to Moscow. Despite this, life seemed relatively calm. The radios were playing patriotic songs, schools were full, and there were lines at the markets, as usual. But behind this apparent normality, some dark clouds were already forming on the horizon. There were rumors. Quiet voices said that Hitler was preparing something, but no one knew exactly what. And most importantly, no one believed that Leningrad, the city of the czars, of culture, of resistance, could actually be attacked. And then everything changed. And then everything changed. Brutally, suddenly, like thunder splitting a blue sky. On the day June 22nd, 1941, as the sun rose over the fields of the Soviet Union, more than 3 million German soldiers crossed the border. Tanks, trucks, planes. It was the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the largest land attack in human history to date. Without warning, without formal declaration, Hitler had broken the non-aggression pact with Stalin. For the Soviet people, it was like waking up and discovering that the enemy was already inside their house. The impact was devastating. The Nazi troops advanced with incredible speed. The Soviet forces, taken by surprise, tried to resist, but were overwhelmed. Entire cities fell within days. Villages were burned. Civilians were shot. It was an all-out war, and Leningrad was now in the crosshairs. Hitler saw Leningrad not just as a military objective, but as a political trophy. He knew what the city meant to the Russians. It was not enough to conquer it. It was necessary to annihilate her, wipe off the map. He even said he didn't want any prisoners, just to let the inhabitants starve to death. Meanwhile, inside the city, the population began to realize that something was wrong. Radios began broadcasting war speeches. The Red Army was mobilized. Young volunteers began to be seen on the streets, digging trenches and carrying sandbags. War had come to Leningrad's door. The German advance was divided into 3 fronts, one headed south towards Kiev, another towards Moscow, and the third, the most cruel in our history, targeted Leningrad. From the north, the Finns also pressed, closing in on the encirclement. Within a few weeks, Wehrmacht troops reached the outskirts of the city. By September 1941, the siege was complete. Now Leningrad was cut off from the world, alone, surrounded, unaware that the next 872 days would be marked by cold, hunger, darkness, and a courage that would defy death itself. September 1941. The summer heat was already beginning to dissipate, and the cold was beginning to creep into the streets of Leningrad. But what was coming from the horizon was much colder than the autumn wind. German troops were closing in. It was official. Leningrad was completely surrounded. To the south and west, the Nazi armies. To the north, Finnish troops, Hitler's allies. To the east, nothingness, forests, swamps, and cold. No roads, no railways, no paths remained. The city was isolated from the rest of the world. From now on, nothing else would come in. No food, no fuel, no medicine, no trains, no convoys, not even letters. Hitler's plan was clear. He did not want to invade Leningrad. He wanted to let her die. Die of hunger, of thirst, of cold, of internal collapse. The Germans surrounded the city like a snake, slowly tightening their grip. Bombings began to hit factories, schools, hospitals, food warehouses. This was not just a military offensive, it was a psychological attack. The goal was to break the spirit of the city. Inside the walls, the population began to panic. Huge lines formed at the few open markets. Bread began to disappear. Bakeries without flour began to make bread with sawdust and grain scraps. The authorities rationed food. The people could no longer buy, only receive small portions with tickets. Meanwhile, men, women, and even children worked to reinforce the defenses. Barricades were erected, trenches dug, and firing points set up on the avenues. It was the entire city preparing to resist, or die trying. But what the inhabitants of Leningrad did not know that September was that the siege that was closing in on them would not last weeks, or even months. It would last almost 900 days. And hunger, not bullets, would be the cruelest enemy. The war was no longer just for the soldiers. It was for the city, for the civilians, for the mothers, for the children, for the elderly. The greatest siege in modern history began, and with it a bloody, silent and relentless battle. The siege was complete. Leningrad, once teeming with life, was now surrounded on all sides. And then the seemingly impossible began to happen. The food is gone. It wasn't an immediate cut, no. It was like a tap dripping dry. Warehouses emptied, military supplies looted by bombings, vegetable gardens destroyed. The city, which depended on supplies from outside, now had no way to feed its more than 1,000 people. Million inhabitants. Hunger, unlike bombs, makes no noise, but it kills with terrible efficiency. The Soviet authorities tried to organize the chaos. They create ration tickets, where each person received a certain amount of food per day. At the height of the shortage, workers received only 250 grams of bread per day. Children and elderly only 125 grams. A bread the size of a small slice, made with flour mixed with sawdust, grain waste, even paper. People began to lose weight at an alarming rate. Their faces became bony, their legs thin, their eyes sunken. Every step required effort. Their bodies ached inside. Mothers gave their children their rations. Old people let themselves die so that the young would have a chance. Logo, the animals disappeared. Cats, dogs, pigeons, even rats. Everything became food. The leather from belts was boiled to make soup. Wallpaper glue was scraped off and mixed with hot water. And yet thousands died every day. It was common to see bodies lying on the streets, covered in snow. No one had the strength to bury them. Sometimes they would lie there for days. The city's trams, without electricity, stopped, and some of them were used to pile up corpses. The Germans knew this. It was exactly what they wanted. They didn't need to invade. They just had to wait. But there was something they didn't expect. The city did not give up. Even when hungry, even when in agony, the people did not surrender. There was no widespread riot, no total breakdown of order. The resistance, though silent, was fierce. Factories were still trying to operate. Schools were holding classes where they could. And many residents, even though malnourished, remained at defense posts, digging trenches or helping neighbors. It was as if, even without food, the people were feeding on hope. But hunger was only the beginning. The real terror would come with the cold. The first winter, cold, death, and the snow that covered Hope Autumn in Leningrad passed with deceptive speed, almost like a silent omen of the coming catastrophe. When the winter of 1941-42 arrived, it did so with unrelenting ferocity, proving to be one of the harshest of the century. In Leningrad, temperatures plummeted to glacial levels, reaching 30 degrees, and biting winds from the Baltic swept through the city, turning every street into a corridor of ice. Snow fell incessantly, covering the landscape in a blanket of white. But this was not the idyllic snow of postcards. It was a silent, cold snow that fell mercilessly on bodies, marking the rhythm of death. The city, already weakened by the starvation imposed by the siege, now faced an equally lethal enemy, the cold. With supply routes cut off, coal and fuel had run out. The central heating systems in homes, public buildings and hospitals had stopped working, turning the interiors into icy traps. People slept in every layer of clothing they owned, wrapped in rags and makeshift blankets, in dark, damp, unheated rooms. Pipes froze and burst, and water became a luxury. Windows, with their glass broken by the bombings, were covered with cardboard and whatever else was available, but still the cold penetrated every crack, every bone. Inside the apartments, entire families huddled around a single candle or a makeshift stove, burning furniture, books, and anything that could generate a minimum of heat. They tried desperately to maintain some human warmth, some flame of life, but it was not always enough. Many succumbed to the cold in their sleep, simply frozen in their beds, without even waking up to feel the final pain. The lack of electricity plunged the city into near total darkness. There was no street lighting, and the streets became dark and dangerous mazes. Trams, once a symbol of urban life, stopped running, their lines frozen and without power. Trains stopped running, and radios, once the only connection to the outside world, went silent. Leningrad, once a vibrant metropolis, fell into a deathly silence, broken only by the distant explosions of German bombing and the groans of pain and despair that echoed through the streets. Food, already scarce, was also affected by the extreme cold. Bread, rationed in tiny portions, arrived frozen and rock-hard from the few bakeries that were still operating. People carried hatchets or knives to cut the slices, a Herculean effort to obtain a morsel of food. Drinking water was a precious and difficult resource to obtain. The only way was to melt ice and snow on makeshift stoves, a slow process that consumed what little energy they had left. Deaths increased at a brutal and terrifying rate. It is estimated that in that first winter alone, around 100,000 people died each month. Victims of hunger, cold, and exhaustion. Bodies piled up on the sidewalks, piled up on the steps of buildings, or were dragged by improvised sleds, often pulled by family members themselves, in a macabre and daily procession. A particularly cruel detail of this tragedy was that the cemeteries were too frozen to dig graves. Many bodies remained for days, or even weeks, waiting for the thaw in a silent and desolate line. And even in the face of such hell, the city did not fall. The Germans bombed it daily, hoping that Leningrad would surrender, that the exhausted and hungry population would break. But what they saw was something that defied military logic, a ghost town that, despite everything, still breathed. There, in the midst of that white hell, the true spirit of Leningrad's resistance was born. Because when everything is taken away from a people, food, warmth, comfort, dignity, what remains is the will to live. And there, that will resisted like a fire hidden under the snow, a stubborn flame that refused to go out. However, the suffering had not yet reached rock bottom. Despair was about to surpass the limits of human understanding, leading to unimaginable acts. But paradoxically, it was in this abyss that a small light of hope began to shine, preparing the ground for the road of life. Cannibalism and despair. The abyss of hunger in Leningrad. In the Siege of Leningrad, hunger transcended mere physical pain to become a devastating force that gnawed at the mind and spirit. It was not just a lack of food, but a constant delirium, a hallucination that distorted reality, transforming itself into an insatiable monster that devoured reason and humanity. In the dead of winter in 1942, with the city's warehouses completely empty, bodies piling up in the streets, and the darkness of deprivation swallowing up any semblance of normalcy, despair reached a level most of us can barely fathom. The Soviet authorities were aware of the situation. Whispered reports, which initially seemed like macabre rumors, soon became irrefutable evidence. Cases of cannibalism began to emerge, isolated at first, but with increasing frequency. These were families who had lost everything. People driven mad by extreme hunger, driven to unimaginable acts. Bodies that should have been mourned and buried with dignity were desecrated to feed the living. It is crucial to understand that these were not monsters, but ordinary people. Mothers, fathers, neighbors, who pushed to the limits of human existence, simply broke inside. Morality and ethics, the pillars of civilization, crumbled in the face of the primal drive for survival. The Soviet secret police, the NKVD, was tasked with dealing with this horrific reality. Its files began to register and arrest cannibals, categorizing cases into two distinct classes: corpse cannibalism, which referred to the consumption of already dead bodies, and murder cannibalism, which involved the killing of a person for the purpose of food. The latter were summarily executed, while the former were arrested, when there was still the strength and resources to make such arrests. However, in many cases, the authorities chose to turn a blind eye. This failure to act was not out of complacency, but rather out of a grim realization that the real blame lay not with the individuals, but with the brutal conditions imposed by the siege, the paralyzing cold, the excruciating hunger, and the relentless warfare. The city was desperately trying to maintain a minimum of order, morale, and dignity. But the siege was winning the psychological battle. Daily life was disfigured. Children, once full of life, stopped playing. Their once curious eyes now looked empty, reflecting exhaustion and trauma. Parents looked at their children with unspeakable anguish, not knowing if they would be able to keep them alive the next day. Trust between neighbors was disintegrating. There were reports of people hiding the bodies of their neighbors, waiting for the right moment to have something to eat. Others, in an act of ultimate desperation, cut the flesh of their own dead relatives. It is a cruel reality, unbearable to imagine, but it was a dark and undeniable truth of life in Leningrad. And even with all this, even with this level of human degradation, with hunger killing thousands every week and the cold taking the lives of those who resisted the famine, the city still did not surrender. This is one of the most impressive and heroic aspects of Leningrad's history. The city, in pieces, in agony, on the verge of total collapse, still resisted. The spirit of the city, though wounded and exhausted, did not die. And there, deep within this abyss of despair, a glimmer of hope began to shine. As the people languished in the besieged city, on the other side of the frozen lake, the Red Army began to hatch a risky plan. A plan to create a route, a path, a thread of life, through the ice that could break the siege and bring relief. The name of this thread of life, the Road of Life. The Road of Life, the ice that saved the besieged city. Amid the relentless siege that suffocated Leningrad, the city found itself in a state of almost absolute despair. Starving, freezing, and under constant bombardment, hope seemed like a distant mirage. Land and rail routes were cut off by Nazi forces, and the city, on the brink of collapse, faced annihilation. It was in this scenario of extreme adversity that, at the height of the harsh Russian winter, when the waters of the vast Lake Ladoga froze, an unlikely path was born, as fragile as it was vital. The legendary Road of Life. This road was not a paved road in the conventional sense, but rather a precarious and dangerous route laid out over the frozen surface of Lake Ladoga, which ran east and north of Leningrad. It represented the only artery of communication and supply that connected the besieged city to the rest of the Soviet Union. Along this icy road, the lives of millions of people depended on the steady flow of essential supplies, food to combat the overwhelming famine, medicine for the sick and wounded, fuel to heat homes and hospitals, and ammunition for the troops defending the city. Conversely, the road of life also served as the only means of getting the most vulnerable, children, the elderly, the sick, and the wounded, out of the doomed city, offering them a chance of survival. However, crossing this icy path was a mission that bordered on suicide. The trucks, often overloaded and ill-equipped for the extreme conditions, faced a myriad of dangers. Biting winds and blizzards blinded drivers and reduced visibility to zero, transforming the landscape into a hostile white desert. The treacherous and unpredictable ice surface was constantly threatened by cracks and holes, where entire vehicles could disappear in seconds into the icy waters of the lake. In addition to the challenges posed by nature, there was the constant and lethal threat of German bombings and air raids. The enemy knew the vital importance of the road of life and tried relentlessly to destroy it, turning every stretch into a minefield of explosions and shrapnel. In this scenario of terror and heroism, drivers and soldiers became unsung heroes. With a courage that defied logic, they braved the extreme cold that froze their fuel and bodies, and the constant danger of being shot or falling through the ice. Each journey was a battle against death, a test of physical and mental endurance. They worked grueling shifts, often without rest, to maintain the tenuous link between Leningrad and the outside world. With every kilometer they traveled, with every load they delivered, they transported not only material goods, but also a little bit of hope that the city desperately needed to continue its fight. Without the road of life, Leningrad would have succumbed much sooner, surrendering to hunger and cold. It was because of it that thousands of people managed to survive, that the resistance found the strength to continue, and that the city managed to stand against all odds. It was not just a supply route, it was the lifeline, the umbilical cord that fed the resilience of a besieged population. Yet despite its inestimable importance, the road of life was narrow, treacherous, and ultimately insufficient to meet all the needs of a city of millions. Transportation capacity was limited, and losses of vehicles and lives were constant. The siege was still firmly established, and the suffering of the population, though mitigated by the existence of the road, remained immense. The road of life was a miracle of ingenuity and sacrifice, but it did not eliminate pain and deprivation. It merely allowed Leningrad to breathe, to fight, and eventually to prevail against one of the most brutal sieges in history. The heroic resistance of the citizens of Leningrad, an unshakable testimony of human resilience. When World War II broke out and Nazi forces advanced relentlessly on the Soviet Union, the city of Leningrad, present-day St. Petersburg, became the epicenter of one of the most brutal and prolonged sieges in history. Unlike conventional battles, where one imagines soldiers in trenches and battlefields, the true and most profound resistance in Leningrad unfolded within the city itself, in the icy streets, in the bombed-out buildings, in the exhausted factories, and, crucially, in the interior of each home. It was a fight for survival that transcended the military sphere, transforming every citizen into a combatant. In this desolate landscape, men, women, the elderly, and even children, everyone became the guardians of their own existence and of the city they loved. The distinction between combatant and civilian was blurred. The front line was everywhere. Every individual, regardless of age or physical condition, assumed a vital role in the collective defense. Resilience was not an option, but an intrinsic necessity in facing the most implacable enemy, the biting cold of the Russian winter and the excruciating hunger that consumed the bodies, transforming them into shadows of their former selves. Yet, despite such adversity, the will to live and resist never wavered. In the factories, under constant threat of bombing and with scarce resources, The workers, many of them hungry and frail, kept up a relentless production. With iron determination, they continued to manufacture weapons, ammunition, and essential equipment for the Soviet army. Every part produced, every shell molded, every vehicle assembled represented not only a piece of war, but a tangible symbol of hope and a new chance for resistance. The assembly line, often manned by trembling hands and exhausted bodies, was as vital a battlefront as the trenches. Meanwhile, the civilian population, with impressive ingenuity, improvised underground shelters, transforming basements and subway stations into refuges from air raids. They dedicated themselves tirelessly to caring for the wounded, setting up makeshift hospitals in any available space, and above all, they strove to keep families together, even when death seemed a constant and inevitable presence. Solidarity and mutual support became fundamental pillars for survival amidst the chaos. The courage of Leningraders was evident in their every action. Often, it was the people themselves who faced the bombings directly, rushing to put out fires caused by incendiaries and rescuing those buried under the rubble of destroyed buildings. They risked their lives without hesitation to save neighbors and strangers, demonstrating a sense of community and sacrifice that defied the logic of individual self-preservation. Young volunteers, driven by ardent patriotism and an unshakable desire to protect their city, enlisted in droves to defend Leningrad. Some, despite their young age and lack of military experience, fought bravely on the front lines, bearing arms and facing the enemy. Others, with the same dedication, worked tirelessly to dig trenches, build barricades and strengthen the city's defenses, turning every street and square into a fortress. Even amidst the despair and devastation, the flame of art and culture did not die out. Concerts were held in empty halls and damaged theaters, with musicians and artists performing to lift the spirits of the population. Dmitri Shostakovich's famous Symphony No. 7, known as the Leningrad Symphony, was performed in the besieged city in 1942 to the distant sound of cannons. This historic performance, broadcast over loudspeakers throughout the city, became a powerful cry of resistance, a symbol of hope, and a challenge to the barbarity that sought to stifle the human spirit. The collective courage and resilience demonstrated by the citizens of Leningrad transformed the siege into something far greater than a simple military defense. It was an overwhelming display of the human spirit, an unshakable testament to what people are capable of enduring, overcoming, and ultimately triumphing over the most extreme adversities. The Siege of Leningrad remains one of the most heroic and moving chapters in history, an eternal reminder of the indomitable strength of the human will. During the 872 days of the Siege of Leningrad, the women of the city were much more than simply survivors. They emerged as unshakable pillars of resistance, hope, and the very continuity of life. In a scenario of unprecedented devastation, where hunger, cold, and death were constant companions, female strength and determination were crucial to the survival of the city and its people. With many men on the front lines, killed in combat or succumbing to deprivation, women took on vital roles in every sphere of life, redefining their roles and demonstrating a capacity for sacrifice and heroism that transcends comprehension. Feminine strength in factories and war production. When war broke out and the siege closed in, the factories of Leningrad, once dominated by men, found their production lines emptied. It was then that women, with remarkable courage and adaptability, took over. They operated heavy machinery, often without prior training, producing ammunition, military equipment, uniforms, and everything else essential to the war effort. They worked grueling shifts, often for 12 to 14 hours a day, even when they barely had the strength to stand, their bodies wasting away. From hunger and the freezing cold, the hands that had once cared for the home and children now forged the steel that would defend the homeland. The production of tanks, weapons and ammunition continued, driven by the resilience of these women workers who transformed pain and despair into a driving force for victory. Guardians of order and civil life. On the streets of Leningrad, women also played a key role in maintaining order and assisting the civilian population. They became makeshift nurses, caring for the wounded in overcrowded hospitals and underground shelters. They organized the distribution of rationed food, often risking their lives under bombardment to ensure that every scrap reached those most in need. They helped organize air raid shelters, clear rubble, and protect families, especially children and the elderly. Women formed civil defense brigades, putting out fires, rescuing victims, and providing first aid, becoming true guardians of the city. Women, fighters, bravery on the front line. Perhaps the most impressive and least known role of Leningrad women was that of combatants. Defying the social norms of the time, many of them volunteered to fight alongside men, serving in a variety of military roles. Some women were in the artillery, operating anti-aircraft guns that protected the skies over Leningrad from enemy aircraft. Others excelled in military engineering, building and repairing bridges, roads and fortifications under enemy fire. And some became legendary, snipers such as Lyudmila Pavlichenko, who, although she did not directly serve in Leningrad, embodies the courage and precision of Soviet female snipers. These women braved the same cold, hunger and danger of death as their male comrades, without hesitation, proving that bravery has no gender. Mothers and protectors, the maternal sacrifice. In addition to all these duties, Leningrad mothers faced the most painful and unimaginable task: protecting their children in conditions of extreme deprivation. Starvation was a cruel choice. Feed your children or feed yourself. Many mothers chose to sacrifice their own rations to ensure that their little ones had a chance to survive, even if it meant slowly wasting away. The pain of watching their children grow sick and waste away was a constant torture, and each day they struggled to give them some food, warmth and hope. The constant fear of loss, the anguish of not being able to protect their children from imminent death, was an overwhelming psychological burden. Yet the strength of maternal love drove these women to acts of daily heroism, transforming them into true lionesses in defense of their cubs. Maintaining culture and hope. Even under bombs and despair, the women of Leningrad fought to keep the city's cultural, educational and medical life alive. Artists, teachers, doctors, scientists, they all helped to keep the flame of civilization alive. Teachers taught in basements and shelters, often with children starving and shivering in the cold. Doctors and nurses worked tirelessly in makeshift hospitals with few resources or medicines, trying to save lives. Artists and musicians performed amid the rubble, offering a brief respite and a reminder of the beauty and humanity that war could not destroy. These women were living proof that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit can find ways to endure and flourish. The women of Leningrad demonstrated a strength that transcends time and borders. Their courage, sacrifice and resilience remain one of the most powerful legacies of the siege, a testament to the unshakable capacity of the human spirit to fight for life, dignity and hope, even when all seems lost. They were the unsung heroes of an epic tragedy, and their stories deserve to be told and remembered forever. Imagine being only a few years old and being thrust into a freezing nightmare where the cold air burns your lungs, hunger eats away at your bones, and the constant roar of bombs becomes the soundtrack of your existence. For the children of Leningrad, this was not a dystopian fantasy, but the cruel and brutal reality of a childhood stolen by the Nazi siege. Millions of innocent people were trapped in a besieged city, becoming witnesses and victims of one of the greatest atrocities of World War II. Childhood lost in hunger and cold. For most Leningrad children, an ordinary childhood of play and discovery was a thing of the past. Instead of running around and laughing, they had to learn how to survive. Hunger was their most insidious enemy, a silent predator that preyed on their growing bodies. Daily rations were minimal, often consisting of just a few hundred grams of bread, made from sawdust and other substitutes. Children's still developing bodies were particularly vulnerable to starvation. Severe malnutrition led to dystrophy, swelling, and extreme weakness, making children easy prey for disease. The cold, with temperatures reaching tens of degrees below zero, was another relentless tormentor. Unheated homes, lack of adequate clothing, and shortages of fuel turned every day into a battle against hypothermia. Many children froze to death in their beds or on the streets, desperately searching for food or warmth. Schools in rubble, classes in darkness. Even amid the chaos, education struggled to hold out. Schools, when they did open, were improvised in basements or underground bunkers, offering a precarious refuge from the relentless bombings. But the reality was that even these places were often too dangerous. Classes were interrupted by air raids, and teachers, as hungry and exhausted as their students, did their best to maintain a sense of normalcy. Reading, writing, and arithmetic were taught by candlelight or oil lamps in cold, damp classrooms. Attendance at school was an act of resistance, an affirmation of life in the midst of death. But attendance was irregular, and many students simply did not have the strength to attend. Parents, unspeakable pain, and unexpected resilience. Parents in Leningrad faced indescribable pain, watching their children waste away day by day. The search for food became an obsession, a daily struggle against hopelessness. Many risked dangerous forays to find any scraps of food that could sustain their little ones. The lack of doctors and medicine made childhood diseases such as measles, diphtheria, and tuberculosis a death sentence. The psychological trauma was immense. Children witnessed the deaths of their parents, siblings, and friends, developing post-traumatic stress disorder that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Many of them were left orphaned, abandoned, needing to find the strength to go on alone in a desolate world. Yet, amid this darkness, the resilience of Leningrad's children shone brightly. Many of them, despite their young age, found ways to help the city resist. They delivered messages, helped care for younger siblings, helped build makeshift defenses, and even acted as messengers for the troops. The story of Tanya Savicheva, an 11-year-old girl who recorded the deaths of each member of her family in a small diary, is a poignant testament to the tragedy and strength of these children. Her diary, with its few, painful words, became a symbol of the brutality of the siege and of the human capacity to endure the unbearable. The living hope of a future. The strength and courage of these children, even in the most difficult circumstances, is one of the greatest testaments to human resilience. They were the living hope of a future that, despite everything, could still exist. Their eyes, though marked by pain and deprivation, held the promise of a tomorrow, of a Leningrad that would rise from the ashes. The struggle for survival of the children of Leningrad is a grim reminder of the cruelty of war, but also a tribute to the indomitable capacity of the human spirit to resist, adapt, and ultimately prevail against the most extreme adversities. Their stories, often untold, are a legacy of courage and a warning that such horrors must never be repeated. While the people of Leningrad endured the hell of hunger and cold within the city walls, outside, the war raged on with unrelenting ferocity. The front lines were not far away. They were positioned just a few kilometers from the residential neighborhoods, where Soviet and Nazi soldiers fought bloody battles. Every inch of land fought for, with life and death. It was a scene of horror and heroism, where the survival of the city depended on the tenacity and sacrifice of those who defended its borders. The formation of impregnable defenses. From the beginning of the siege on September 8, 1941, Leningrad was transformed into a fortress. The Leningrad Workers' Dispute Council mobilized millions of civilians to build defensive fortifications. These were not just soldiers. Men, women, and even children built a complex defense system with shovels and pickaxes. Hundreds of kilometers of wooden barricades, anti-tank trenches, earth and wood trenches, and iron and concrete installations were built in record time, booty. The cannon of the cruiser Aurora, a symbol of the Russian Revolution, was mounted on Pulkovo Mountain south of Leningrad, ready to spew fire at the enemy. The main lines of defense stretched from the Luga River to Chudovo, Gatchina, Uritsk, Pulkovo, and then across the Neva River. Another defensive line ran through Peterhof, Gatchina, Pulkovo, Kolpino, and Koltushi. These fortifications were not just physical barriers, they were a manifestation of Leningrad's unbreakable will not to give in. The Soviet troops, even in precarious conditions, with limited supplies and facing a harsh winter, resisted with a bravery that bordered on fanaticism. They knew that if these lines were breached, the city would fall for good, and the fate of millions of people would be sealed. Air battle and anti-aircraft defense. In addition to its ground defenses, Leningrad had a robust anti-aircraft defense system. German air raids were constant and devastating, turning entire neighborhoods into rubble and destroying factories, schools, and hospitals. The German Air Force began an intense bombardment of the region from the beginning of the offensive. On September 4, 1941, the bombing of Leningrad began, and by September 8th, it had caused 178 fires. Soviet anti-aircraft batteries, often manned by women, worked tirelessly to protect the city from air attacks, transforming the sky over Leningrad into a terrifying spectacle of fire and smoke. Each enemy plane shot down was a small victory, a breath of relief for the terrified population. Life in the trenches, cold, hunger, and crossfire. For soldiers on the front lines, life was a daily ordeal. They lived in trenches and makeshift bunkers, braving the bitter cold of the Russian winter, which often reached minus tens of degrees. Lack of food and supplies was a constant reality, and many fought on empty stomachs, driven only by the determination to protect their homeland. Enemy fire was relentless, with artillery, machine gun, and infantry attacks following one another day and night. Every patrol, every advance, every defense was a risk to life and death. These lines of defense were vital to maintaining the siege. At any moment, the city could have been overrun, but the Soviet fighters held firm, transforming Leningrad into a symbol of unwavering resistance. The sacrifice of these soldiers is an essential chapter in the history of the siege, for without their resistance, the city would have fallen much sooner, and Leningrad's fate would have been sealed in a much more tragic way. The bravery and resilience demonstrated on the front lines were a testament to the human capacity to endure the unbearable and fight for what one believes in, even in the face of the most absolute horror. For more than a year, the city of Leningrad remained suffocated under the relentless siege of German and Finnish troops. Every supply and communication route was blocked, turning the metropolis into an island of despair and resilience. Yet the Red Army, despite overwhelming losses and the apparent invincibility of the enemy, never gave up on Leningrad. With each passing day, the determination to break through the ring of steel that strangled the city grew, culminating in a series of brutal and bloody offensives. From the first months of the siege, numerous operations were planned and executed with a single goal: to open a corridor to Leningrad and alleviate the unspeakable suffering of its population. These battles were not mere tactical clashes. They were epic clashes marked by extreme ferocity, where the difficult terrain, frozen swamps, dense forests and minefields became an enemy as lethal as bullets and shelling. The losses on both sides were colossal, but with every meter gained, hope for Leningrad was rekindled. Operation Iskra, the spark of hope. One of the most crucial and decisive efforts to break the siege was Operation Iskra, Operation Spark, launched in January 1943. This offensive, meticulously planned by the Soviet command, aimed to create a breach in the blockade south of Lake Ladoga. Soviet forces, consisting of elements of the Leningrad Front and the Volkhov Front, simultaneously attacked German positions, seeking a rallying point that could establish a land connection with the besieged city. The battle for Operation Iskra was a hell of ice and fire. Soviet troops faced fierce German resistance, entrenched in well-fortified defensive positions. The snow-covered and marshy terrain made advancing difficult, turning every step into a grueling struggle. Thousands of Soviet soldiers lost their lives in the battles of icy swamps and dense forests, facing mines, incessant airstrikes, and relentless crossfire. The courage and sacrifice of these men was beyond comprehension, for they knew that the lives of millions of civilians depended on their success. On January 18, 1943, after days of fierce fighting, Soviet forces achieved the unthinkable. Troops from the Leningrad Front and the Volkhov Front met near the settlement of Schlisselburg, opening a narrow land passage about 8 to 10 kilometers wide. This small victory, although it seemed insignificant on a war map, dramatically changed the dynamics of the siege. It was the first significant relief in more than a year of total isolation and dangerous road of life across the ice of Lake Ladoga was established. Food, weapons, ammunition, and, crucially, medicine began to arrive in greater quantities. Hope, which had previously been a luxury, became a tangible reality. In addition, the wounded and sick could be evacuated more safely, saving countless lives that would otherwise have been doomed. A narrow-gauge railway and a road were quickly built through the newly opened corridor, allowing a steady flow of supplies to the starving city. However, the opening of this corridor did not mean the end of the fighting. German forces, aware of the strategic importance of this gap, launched fierce counterattacks to try to close the passage. The fighting continued to rage, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Every meter of ground, every inch of railway, every load of supplies that reached Leningrad told a story of sacrifice and heroism. The Victory Road, as the corridor was nicknamed, was constantly bombed and attacked, but the Soviet determination to keep it open was unwavering. Even with the corridor, life in Leningrad remained a trial. Food rations were still scarce, and the city remained under threat of aerial and artillery bombardment. However, Operation Iskra was a turning point. It not only relieved the pressure on the city, but also boosted the morale of the population and troops. Leningrad was no longer completely isolated. There was a connection, a thread of hope that connected it to the rest of the country. This small victory, won with blood and sweat, demonstrated that despite all the suffering, Leningrad remained steadfast, resisting against all odds and defying the logic of war. The resilience of the civilian population, which had endured hell on earth, combined with the bravery of the Red Army, made the Siege of Leningrad an eternal symbol of resistance and sacrifice in the history of World War II. Deliver expanded content to the user after 872 days of unimaginable suffering, where hunger and cold were as deadly as German bullets. Hope finally began to materialize in Leningrad. In January 1944, the Red Army, with iron determination, launched a massive offensive to finally break the siege that had imprisoned the city for more than 2 years and 4 months. It was not just a military issue, it was a question of survival, of honor, and of revenge against Nazi barbarity. Operation Spark, launched in January 1943, had already succeeded in opening a narrow land corridor to Leningrad, allowing a minimal flow of supplies and the evacuation of some civilians. However, the city was still under constant German artillery fire, and the threat of famine persisted. The real liberation would come with Operation Leningrad Novgorod, launched on January 14, 1944. This coordinated offensive aimed to push German forces away from the city and permanently restore communication and supply lines. The battle was brutally intense. Fierce fighting broke out on all fronts, with Soviet troops pushing against German, Fortifications and desperate enemy resistance. The determination of the Soviet soldiers, many of them exhausted and scarred by the war, was unshakable. They fought not only for Leningrad, but for every life lost, every family torn apart, every piece of bread denied them. The tireless resistance of the citizens inside the city, who had endured years of deprivation and bombardment, was also crucial. They had turned Leningrad into an impregnable fortress, and now, with the support of the Red Army, they were ready for the final counter-offensive. Soviet troops advanced relentlessly, pushing the enemy back from the city gates. On January 27, 1944, after days of fierce fighting, the blockade was finally and completely broken. Leningrad could breathe again, a collective sigh of relief that echoed throughout the Soviet Union. The news of the liberation was greeted with a volley of artillery fire in Moscow, a sign of victory and recognition of Leningrad's resilience. Although the city lay in ruins, with buildings destroyed, infrastructure devastated, and a decimated population, freedom was a precious gift, one at immense cost. The end of the siege did not mean an immediate end to suffering. Thousands had already died of hunger, disease, and cold, and many of the survivors bore the physical and psychological scars of the ordeal. Reconstruction would be a Herculean, long and painful task, requiring years of effort and sacrifice. Nevertheless, the liberation marked the beginning of a new era for Leningrad. The city, which had resisted when all seemed lost, became an eternal symbol of courage, suffering, and resilience. Its history, etched in iron and fire, was forever etched in the collective memory, a testament to the indomitable human strength in the face of the most absolute horror. The human and social consequences of the Siege of Leningrad. The Siege of Leningrad, which lasted for almost days, was one of the darkest and most brutal pages of the Second World War. The end of the siege on January 1st, 1915, did not mean the end of the pain, but rather the beginning of a long and arduous journey of recovery for a devastated city and people. Hunger, cold, incessant bombings, and direct combat took the lives of an appalling portion of the population. It is estimated that around 1 million people died in Leningrad during the siege. The human toll of resistance, the loss of life, was catastrophic. Leningrad lost almost a third of its original population. The once vibrant streets became silent witnesses to an unprecedented tragedy. Entire families were decimated, leaving behind a trail of orphans and widows that multiplied exponentially. The entire city had to learn to live with the absence of loved ones, a wound that would never fully heal. Hunger, in particular, was as lethal a weapon as German bombs. The siege was planned by Hitler to starve the population to death, avoiding the need to feed prisoners or deal with epidemics. Hunger as a weapon of extermination. The famine in Leningrad was not just a consequence of the war, but a deliberate tactic of extermination. Food rations were drastically reduced, and the population was forced to resort to desperate measures to survive. The consumption of wood glue, petroleum jelly, and even animal dung became a grim reality. Cannibalism, although not officially admitted by the state, was a tragic reality in Leningrad, propagated throughout several territories to make the myth of Russian inferiority true. Bread rations, the staple food, were cut 4 times. In November, at the height of winter, hunger reached unbearable levels. Alexander Wirth, a historian, described how people began to starve to death. Only of the original millions of inhabitants had survived until the end of the siege, many of them suffering from severe dystrophy. The death rate was staggering, with tens of thousands of deaths per month, especially among women, who were more prone to starvation due to their physiology and role as caregivers. Infrastructure destruction and social reorganization. In addition to the human loss, the city's infrastructure was in ruins. Historic buildings and residential buildings were destroyed, factories lay in rubble, hospitals were overcrowded, and the streets were littered with debris. Rebuilding Leningrad would be a monumental task that would take years, requiring collective effort and scarce resources. Society had to reorganize itself amidst this devastation, leaving deep scars on people's minds and bodies. Collective memory and the legacy of resistance. Even in the face of such loss and suffering, the collective memory of resistance, courage, and sacrifice became the basis for the reconstruction and rebirth of Leningrad. Survivors carried not only the physical scars of famine and war, but also stories of heroism and resilience that were to be passed on to future generations. The diary of Elena Mukina, a young woman who lost her entire family to famine, is a poignant testament to this time, detailing the daily struggle for survival and personal transformation in the face of tragedy. Diaries like Elena's were not only records of suffering, but also a form of resistance. They allowed women to become historical subjects in a world that too often silenced them. Writing became a lifelong legacy, a way of ensuring that human strength in the face of horror would never be forgotten. The Siege of Leningrad is not just an event buried in the past. It is living history, a lasting testament to what it means to resist in the face of the most brutal suffering and the most extreme adversity. The living memory of the city today, the city that was once called Leningrad and has now reverted to its original name, St. Petersburg, bears the deep marks of that era in its streets, buildings, and monuments. Throughout the city there are memorials dedicated to the nearly 1 million people who died during the siege. The most famous of these is the Monument to the Defenders of Leningrad, an impressive tribute that recalls the courage and sacrifice of soldiers and civilians. Furthermore, the Siege of Leningrad Museum IT is a fundamental center for preserving the stories, objects and documents of that period. There, visitors can feel the atmosphere, understand the daily difficulties of life under siege, and hear personal stories that bring the past to life. A worldwide symbol of resistance. The siege is studied not only in Russia, but throughout the world as an extreme example of human resilience. It is a powerful warning of the consequences of total war, where the civilian population becomes the greatest victim. Looking at the siege, we realize how much solidarity, collective strength, and individual courage can overcome fear and despair. Lessons for the present and future. In a world still marked by conflict, the legacy of the Siege of Leningrad reminds us of the importance of peace and the need to protect civilians in times of war. It is also a lesson in the resilience of the human spirit. Even in the face of extreme hunger, biting cold and constant threat of death, the population resisted, keeping hope alive. The stories that need to be told, the voice of survivors, and the legacy for future generations. The stories of the Siege of Leningrad are not mere historical records. They are living testimonies, pulsating with the pain, resilience, and hope of millions. Survivors of the siege, with admirable courage, have come forward to share their memories, ensuring that the world never forgets what happened. These narratives are incredibly powerful because they humanize war in a way that numbers and statistics never could. They transport us beyond the death tolls and material destruction, revealing lives, interrupted dreams, torn families, and yet an unbreakable will to carry on, to resist, to live. Each account is a thread that weaves the complex tapestry of human experience under extreme conditions, showing the capacity for sacrifice, unexpected solidarity, and the persistence of the spirit. To ensure that the memory of the siege is not lost in the mists of time, a wide range of works has been produced. Countless books, from personal diaries to in-depth historical analyses, have been written. Films and documentaries capture the grim atmosphere and the daily struggle, while academic research continues to uncover new facets of this tragedy. All this effort has a fundamental purpose: to ensure that New generations understand the devastating price of war and the invaluable worth of resistance. It is a legacy of knowledge and emotion transmitted through various media so that the barbarity of the past serves as a warning for the future. A legacy for future generations, memory, inspiration, and warning. The memory of the Siege of Leningrad is not merely preserved, it is actively cultivated and taught. In schools in St. Petersburg, formerly Leningrad, and across Russia, significant time is dedicated to studying the siege. This approach goes beyond simply presenting historical facts. It seeks to transform the tragedy into a source of inspiration. Young people learn that courage can emerge from the most difficult situations, and that solidarity, unity, and mutual support can literally save lives. The history of the siege becomes a laboratory of human resilience, where one understands that even in the face of the most overwhelming adversity, the human spirit can prevail. This collective memory, however, is also a solemn warning. It serves as a constant reminder that horrors like those experienced in Leningrad must never happen again. It is an appeal for political decisions to be made with full awareness of the suffering they can cause to ordinary people who are invariably the greatest victims of wars. The history of Leningrad is a silent cry that echoes through time, pleading for peace and for a humanity that prioritizes life and dignity above conflicts and ambitions. It is a legacy that invites us to reflect on the fragility of peace and the responsibility of each generation to protect it. The eternal legacy of Leningrad, a beacon of human resilience. The Siege of Leningrad, which lasted for an agonizing 872 days, far transcended the definition of a mere military battle. It was an epic of monumental proportions, a titanic struggle for survival, for the preservation of dignity, and for the preservation of hope in the midst of the deepest despair. For nearly 3 years, men, women, and children, most of them civilians, faced an unforgiving triad of enemies: excruciating hunger, paralyzing cold, incessant bombing, and death lurking around every corner. They resisted with a tenacity that defied logic, persisting when all odds pointed to imminent collapse. This story cannot be reduced to mere death tolls or the extent of material destruction. It is, above all, a poignant testament to the indomitable strength of the human spirit. It is the story of how, even in the face of the most brutal suffering and the deepest degradation, solidarity and courage can emerge, illuminating the deepest darkness of war. In Leningrad, humanity did not completely fall apart. It reinvented itself in adversity, forging bonds of mutual support and acts of everyday heroism that became the very essence of resistance. Leningrad teaches us that the real battle is often fought not on the battlefield, but in the unbreakable will to survive and protect what we love. It shows us, with painful clarity, that hope can blossom even in the harshest winters, that courage can be born from the most primitive hunger and fear, and that humanity has the capacity to rise and persist even when crushed by the most extreme violence. The resilience demonstrated by the citizens of Leningrad is a beacon of light on the human capacity to endure the unbearable. As we recall the Siege of Leningrad, we are compelled to reflect on the crucial lessons it offers us for the present and the future. It reminds us of the imperative need to value peace above all else, to protect the innocent, and to never, ever forget the unspeakable horrors that war inflicts on those who depend most on our protection: civilians. The story of Leningrad is a timeless warning against the barbarity and dehumanization that accompany armed conflict. Today, as we walk through the rebuilt streets of St. Petersburg, once Leningrad, as we watch children grow up in freedom and listen to the music echoing from theaters that once lay in ruins, we must carry in our hearts the memory of those who resisted, the memory of those who did not give up, who, with their courage and sacrifice, wrote one of the most heroic and moving pages of the history of the Soviet Union. history of humanity. May this memory serve as an inspiration to never again allow fear and destruction to rob our world of its humanity. May the legacy of Leningrad live on, reminding us all that even in the darkest and most desperate times, the light of hope can shine brightly, and that the strength of a united people can overcome even the most relentless sieges, transforming tragedy into an everlasting testament to the resilience and triumph of the human spirit.